I'm going to go into the next one. I'm just going to give a brief intro like I did for the previous one about what the question is. So this debate is going to be based versus non-based sequencing with Josh and Justin. Really quickly, we'll just go over based sequencing. So based sequencing, you have L1 nodes, or the L1 proposers get to sequence L2 transactions, and then based sequencing also inherits the liveness and the credible neutrality of the L1. There are some other properties that some definitions of based sequencing include, but for this discussion, we're going to call that our definition of based sequencing. So there's advantage of this. You get good decentralization, liveness, censorship resistance. You get improved interoperability with the L1, and also between multiple rollups. I already discussed this part, so I'll skip through here. In vanilla-based sequencing without preconfers, you would have to, transactions would only be sequenced every 12 seconds on Ethereum, and you don't really get the UX that you get from centralized sequencers today. But obviously with pre-confirmations, you can get like less than 100 milliseconds latency, as Justin described in his talk. So we have base sequencing 2.0, which is basically we can use an external finality gadget. This is kind of that layer 1.5 I talked about previously, but I'll kind of skip over that because we already talked about that. So here is maybe a rundown of the differences. So base rollups, you get transactions are dependent on some unfinalized Ethereum state. So I want to explain this one a little bit further. In current rollups today, a lot of rollups will choose to base their rollup blocks on finalized Ethereum state, or at least Ethereum state that's like sufficiently deep in the chain so it's not going to reorg. In vanilla-based sequencing, the transactions are reliant on the L1 block that they're included in, and maybe this L1 block has a lot higher chance of reorging. Maybe that's not good. Based rollups give you synchronous interactions with the L1, since it's the same party that's proposing for both the L1 and the L2. Non-based rollups, you only get asynchronous interactions. And then finally, with based rollups, you can have some additional fast finality layer, this layer 1.5, but if you don't have that, then you get the finality of Ethereum, which maybe is kind of slow. With non-based rollups, it's very easy to get this fast finality gadget, and you kind of get it for free. I'm actually going to skip these, and we'll just kind of go into the debate. So I don't actually have a question slide here, but basically our question is going to be, should rollups transition to based sequencing or not? With the definition of based sequencing that one, it's the L1 proposer that gets to decide the transaction order, and two, based sequencing inherits the liveness and credible neutrality of the L1. So with that, we can go ahead and jump in. Okay, let me just set up my timer here. And I think I'm not sure where Tina went, but we also have a poll for this one as well that we wanted to poll now and at the end. So go ahead and vote in your poll for poll number 2. Okay, let's start with Justin. Your opening arguments for three minutes.
Okay, so I think Josh and I both agree on the previous question, which is whether or not we want to have a shared sequencer. And now the question is, which shared sequencer? And then basically, we need to look at various properties of the shared sequencer. And in my opinion, there's like 3 that are very, very important. One is credible neutrality. And the reason why it's important is because we want to build this neutral playground for every rollup and their competitors to feel comfortable opting in to this shared sequencer. So the classic example that I give is that imagine that if Arbitrum comes up with its own shared sequencer and Optimism comes up with its own shared sequencer, are they going to want to mutually use each other's shared sequencer? And the answer is going to be probably no, because they have these competitive dynamics. And in some sense, if you look within the Ethereum ecosystem, the Ethereum shared sequencer is the most credibly neutral. There's nothing more credibly neutral. You've already opted in, you've already bought into Ethereum as a credible brand and a credible system. So there's no loss of credible neutrality to opting in to Ethereum layer 1 as a shared sequencer. The other aspect of shared sequencing is security. And this is a very similar argument. So when you build a rollup or layer 2, there's like several things that you need to care about. You need to care about settlement, data availability, execution, and sequencing. And in some sense, from a security standpoint, at first approximation, is going to be whatever your weakest link is. So if your weakest link is, let's say, some sort of off-chain consensus that uses your token, and this token only has, let's say, $1 billion of economic security, well, that's going to be your weakest link from a liveness standpoint. Like, I can 51% attack your external sequencer and then do bad things like extract toxic MEV and maybe force a mass exit or disable pre-confirmations or whatever it is. But if you use the Ethereum L1 as a sequencer, then now there's no additional security assumption that you're introducing. Like for all of these things, settlement, data, execution, and sequencing is the same security assumption, and it's Ethereum is secure, and there's no weakest link because they're all the exact same strength. And so from a security standpoint, that is the optimal thing you can do. And then there's this final question, which is around network effects. Like Ethereum has a ton of network effects. It has $500 billion of TVL. It has applications that possibly will never migrate. Like CryptoPunks will never migrate to Arbitrum. Like CryptoPunks are native to the L1. ENS is native to the L1. And then various whales are native to the L1 and might never want to move for various reasons. And I think by tapping into these network effects, that is like the best thing you can do. Instead of having a cold start problem, that way you start your shared sequencer from scratch, and now you need to ramp up your TVL, well, now you can just incrementally plug into what already exists, which is $500 billion, soon several $1 trillion of TVL. And this kind of brings us to this notion of Metcalfe's law, right, where the value of the network effect grows quadratically in the size of the network. And so if you have, for example, Ethereum layer 1, which is, let's say, 10x larger than Arbitrum, well, that's going to be 100x delta, potentially, in network effects. And so really, it's really difficult for an isolated sequencer to build the same kind of network effects. And so I think there's going to be these natural market forces for the L1 to win out because of credible neutrality, security, and network effects.
All right, Josh.
Okay, so my view is going to come from kind of a perspective of, I would say, like incumbent versus like startup. And that is that Ethereum, as Justin pointed out, is like the dominant kind of existing platform, but fundamentally it was a chain that was not created for the purpose of doing sequencing or shared sequencing, if we want to like specify to that. It was a chain made to be an L1, and then throughout its life cycle, right, it was adapted to support L2s and like the roll-up centric roadmap and like various things on top of that. But fundamentally, it was never like from day one built to support shared sequencing, and thus there's a lot of kind of like pitfalls. I think if you look at the L1.5 designs or L2 or whatever you want to call it, where you have a separate consensus mechanism for a shared sequencer, you have a strong benefit of kind of finality from that, and you can use consensus mechanism that gives you this kind of fast finality, and you don't have this like slower finality dependent on the base layer, which is fundamentally why people used sequencers in the first place, right? The original designs of rollups were base rollups. They assume you just submit the transactions to the L1, and then they are derived into the roll-up state machine. But people moved to sequencers and centralized sequencers because those were the low-hanging fruit, and they provided users with a better experience. And generally, my view is that the market cannot be ignored, and what I mean by that is if some external, there's a sense of like a domestic versus an international thing. And what I mean by that, like within the sphere of like Ethereum's domestic domain, it can say these are the changes we're going to do, but it cannot prevent like an international or like an exogenous kind of competitor, something like a Solana, or in some case you can view the L2s with centralized sequencer like this, from creating a product that has a different trade-off space and a different design consideration that may provide a more desirable user experience. And fundamentally, it's not within kind of like Ethereum's purview to prevent those external actors from creating a service that may be more desirable. And so if we want to kind of confront, say, centralizing vectors from some of those things, we need to create a product from scratch that is kind of built to satisfy the kind of expectations of users that they're used to on kind of centralized sequencers today. So if we want a decentralized sequencer, if we want to have the shared sequencers, I think we need a native chain that is just built to support that specific use case that doesn't come with some of the baggage is not the ideal term, but this kind of legacy kind of sense of Ethereum doing many things. Fundamentally, the modular ecosystem I view as being something about separation of concerns and building more kind of limited pieces, somewhat of like a Unix philosophy, where it's a small tool that does one thing. You can build a chain that is existing purely for the sense of doing shared sequencing. It is not also doing settlement. It is not also doing execution of its own. Purely exists to do shared sequencing. Is that?
Yeah, no,
Okay.
perfect. 3 minutes. All right, Justin, you have 5 minutes for a rebuttal.
Okay, so I guess there were 2 points that stood out to me. One is that the market kind of initially started with the most naive solution, which is base sequencing, and then for some reason moved away from base sequencing. And this move from the market might suggest that base sequencing is inadequate in some way. Now, the way that I see it is that the move from base to centralized sequences is for 3 key reasons. Key reason number 1 is that base sequencing, a few years ago, we didn't realize that it could provide pre-confirmations. And today, we do know how to provide pre-confirmations with base sequencing. And so I think that is like one of the major unlocks. The second thing is around MEV protection. Like right now on Ethereum Layer 1, you don't have MEV protection. You broadcast your Uniswap transaction on the public mempool, you're going to get sandwiched. And rollups were like, oh, well, we can provide MEV protection for free. Just trust us. And they are trustworthy because they're entities with lots of reputation. And they provide this great MEV protection. You won't get sandwiched on Arbitrum or on Uniswap. And again, here it's like almost a technological problem where the L1 needs to catch up in terms of services that are being provided. And the way that you catch up is by building encrypted mempools using something other than trust. So you can use a threshold encryption, you can use delay encryption, you can use SGX, which is enclave encryption. But there needs to be some sort of a solution for users. And then the third reason why rollups preferred centralized sequencing over base sequencing is like this subtle thing around security training wheels. My guess is that every single rollup has critical vulnerabilities, every one of them. And so this is really scary because now, like an attacker who's a black hat can go and exploit, all these rollups one by one. But the rollups, they're very clever. They're like, we're going to accept the fact that we have vulnerabilities, but we're going to have layers of defense. We're going to have security in depth. And one of the layers of security in depth is the centralized sequencer, which will only include on-chain transactions that have been vetted. So if an attacker tries to exploit some sort of like weird edge case and craft some sort of fancy transaction, the shared sequencer is going to say, hey, that doesn't pass the smell test. I'm not even going to include it on-chain. And so you can't even exploit the bug, even though it's there on-chain. And so what I think we need to do is basically have defense in depth which isn't like just based on centralized sequencing. So we need to have multi-proving, we need to have formal verification, we might need to have like this native EVM, opcode idea. But all this to say that the reason why the rollups are not using base sequencing is not for fundamental reasons that can't be fixed. It's just because there was like this quick hack to get MEV protection, to get the training wheels, and to get the pre-confirmations, all of which we can get with base sequencing. Now, the other point that was brought up by Josh is that in order to do pre-confirmations really well, best-in-class pre-confirmations, we need to build something from scratch. Because otherwise you're going to be like missing features and whatnot. And actually, I totally disagree here in the sense that we just got so lucky. We got lucky that from Genesis, there was this amazing pre-confirmation layer that was hiding in plain sight. And in some sense, it's a little bit similar to cold data, right? So cold data was just there from Genesis at day one, and rollups have been able to consume cold data. And like sure, like we have been able to improve it with the blobs, we're going to have more data. But putting aside scalability, which is not an issue with pre-confirmations, in some sense, cold data is like good enough. Now, okay, I said scalability is not an issue for pre-confirmations, just to make sure this is all very clear in people's mind. Basically, we have we can have proposer-builder separation, right? Like, so you can have the proposer run on a Raspberry Pi, and you can have the builder just run 1,000 full nodes and have a super cluster. So scalability is not an issue there. Now, the one small detail that does come into base sequencing, but is really a minor detail, is around the size of the lookback. So is it called lookback? Look ahead. Thank you. So basically, on the beacon chain today, you can know who the next 32 proposers will be, actually between 32 and 64. And it would be actually slightly nicer if this was 128 or always 64. And so, but this is like such a minor detail, and it's a very easy hard fork to just increase the look ahead. Sure, like maybe there's a few things that can be polished, but fundamentally we just got extremely lucky, and without having to do anything, we can have a best-in-class shared sequencer.
All right, Josh, your rebuttal.
So I guess the assumption we're working on is that base sequencing is going to provide the fast pre-confirmations via the kind of, I don't know what we want to call the design, but the request and the response to the user, and then potentially with the gateway, right? Wherein we have a user sending a transaction potentially to a gateway, because the gateway may be, call it like a reverse proxy that knows where like all the other pre-confers have like registered themselves, and the capacity to find these pre-confers is dependent on the ability to like see them in like the look ahead, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So I guess my view on that is that fundamentally there's a question of kind of how you're going to get the kind of in these pre-confirmations. What we've done with this gateway is we've like introduced yet another, I'm going to call it like a proxy, but we've introduced like one more like trusted third-party layer in the mix of this entity that a user is interacting with that is responsible for kind of like redirecting user transactions. Redirecting is not the right word, but like forwarding user transactions to like another set of like entities.
I mean, that's pre-execution tickets. With execution tickets, we don't have this extra party.
Right, but I suppose that leads back to my original point on some of the difficulties of using kind of this, again, I don't want to call like legacy or whatever, but it is the idea that you said, right? Like fundamentally Ethereum is a conservative blockchain, very intentionally so, right? It has $500 billion on it, is not something that you want to kind of like mess with like a very liberal manner. And so the development of some of these kind of pre-confirmations in what I would call like a best-in-class kind of capability relies on features being added to the L1. And I think one of the big kind of points to like generalize this, right? We have the specificity of execution tickets, and to some degree I think various inclusion list designs would also provide like benefits to this pre-confirmation design, right? And potentially, ePBS, though I guess we're more transitioning like execution tickets as like a similar solution here, right? For your what was Connor terming? Your ahead of time versus your just in time kind of like proposer auction, right? But fundamentally, these are things that have kind of conflicting priorities from an improvement to like the Ethereum L1, right? Kind of harkening back to the debate with Dankred, right? Fundamentally, there are split opinions on what is the optimal thing to spend effort on in the development, of core development time, of research time, for improving like Ethereum, the L1. And there are questions of whether that effort should be focused on providing, execution tickets, which may be positioned as something that dramatically improves the ability for Ethereum L1 to be used as a shared-based sequencer. But maybe that conflicts with, development resources that would be spent on whether it's Verkle trees or some other kind of, there's a long list of like improvements being, researched and worked on. So there is this kind of divide, and I think this is one of the things we see in L2s more generally, wherein, again, to one of Dankred's points, they've developed their own kind of ecosystem in their kind of community, and one of the things that gives them is this capacity to have their own priorities and not necessarily be kind of beholden to the L1's fundamental ecosystem. So when we think about kind of credible neutrality as like a benefit here, to some degree, it is also it's probably too harsh to say like it reduces to the lowest common denominator, but like directionally in that way, it is saying if you want to have an improved functionality that requires the base layer to improve, you will be dependent on the velocity of that base layer. And again, that's why kind of I, as like an individual, have not kind of historically spent my time in the Ethereum research community. I went to like, more of the Celestia and like that modular ecosystem, primarily, not because I dislike Ethereum or the kind of Ethereum research ecosystem, but because I thought this is a place that is doing very similar kind of directional kind of solutions of, it's still a modular design, but it's doing it from a new starting point and is able to have higher velocity because, again, we pay the trade-off of not having, $500 billion of security. You have to bootstrap your security. It's very difficult to bootstrap these networks. But it gives you the advantages of being able to move dramatically faster. And my view is that, that lets us get a product to market sooner. And, a lot of this might be biased by the current market timing and the kind of, mental kind of space you're in where, the moment you start seeing like the coins go up, there is a sense of kind of mania kind of falling upon the broader industry. And so there is this desire to say, we need to get something out now. And when you rely on, an intentionally kind of conservative base layer, you're not necessarily able to kind of keep up. And so I think you'll see kind of divergences from like L2 saying, well, yes, sure, maybe I want, a shared sequencer, and maybe it would be nice to use a base sequencer, but I'm not comfortable waiting, 5 years for that or 3 years for that or however long it is. They're going to work with what, in some ways I think could be argued to be like a less optimal solution, but something that is available now rather than something that's kind of theoretically in the future.
So I have a couple of questions I want to ask, but we can also continue this debate. So I have a question that I'm going to ask both of you. We can start with Justin. So this was something that Josh brought up before this panel, was that in classic-based sequencing, all of the L1 validators are participating, and they can all be proposers. But in the design for base sequencing with pre-confirmations, it's only a small subset. And the question is that really based sequencing?
Right. I have relaxed my definition to base sequencing where like some subset of the L1 proposers are participating as opposed to all of them. Now, one of the interesting things is that I actually expect if base sequencing to kick up, to be successful, that 100% minus epsilon, meaning almost all layer 1 proposers will start playing that game. And the reason is that it's similar to mev boost. Right? Like on mev boost today, I think it's something like 95% of validators use mev boost, which is the vast majority. And the reason is that show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. And the incentives are actually pretty stark. And the reason is that let's assume that only 50% of the L1 proposers have opted in to being sequencers and pre-confirmers. What that means is that your average block time as a base sequencer is actually 2 slots, so it's 24 seconds. And so you're going to be able to get 24 seconds worth of flow and MEV and whatnot. And this is even more stark at the very beginning. Let's say there's only 1%. Well, now you have like 100 times more MEV because your slot time is 100 times longer. So I expect, if we can get through this cold start problem of like 10, 15, 20%, we'll quickly get to 95%. And part of the good news here is that like there are like large entities and infrastructure builders that are looking to do just that, solve the cold start problem. So I don't want to leak too much alpha, but there's like some big operators out there that want to play this pre-confirmation game and they want to solve the cold start problem.
All right, Josh, I'll ask you the same question.
So I guess, can you repeat maybe the specific question? Because I can talk about the general kind of principle of like my view on, is this based sequencing? Yeah. And I think my view or the kind of question I kind of have about that is, if you are requiring a subset, and I agree, right? Like it's like what 20% I think with like a 32 look ahead gives you like a 99.5 or 99.95 or something, and 30% gets you like 4 nines, and that is like sufficient, right? And that is what you get Lido and Coinbase and Chorus One and P2P or whatever, and you're good, right? Yeah. And so I don't think that's difficult. I think the question is, what is the kind of trust assumption may not be the right word, but it's like how are we defining what is something that is like based when we say a subset of the entities, which may be a superset of the entities, are now required to run like an additional piece of software that is like a sidecar that presumably has higher resource requirements. I think in like mev boost, right, we don't yeah, like on the margin, right? There are like higher resource requirements, but like functionally that is outsourced to like the relays and the builders and the searchers. But in this case, for like the pre-confers, right? We are going to run into like a similar situation where, again, we're going to say, okay, the pre-confers, if they want to like do it themselves, but like as evidenced, right, validators seem to prefer being lazy entities, and now we have once again kind of, and I think proposability is actually like good, but there is this kind of sense in which, and maybe this is like a broader kind of like theoretical question of like, what is in protocol, what is out of protocol, right? Is the MEV supply chain like part of the Ethereum protocol of like 93% of the blocks for like, what, a year and a half now, have like run through that. That's kind of part of the protocol. If it went away, things would be like problematic. But there is this question of like, is it still based if you're adding like significant software that we assume that like, a large majority, like a super majority of the nodes in the network are going to run, and then we're going to lead to kind of inevitably them outsourcing that once again. So I don't think it's necessarily, I'm arguing like against that. I just have like a question of like, when we say something is based and thus it is kind of inheriting like just the L1, we are actually assuming we are adding like a new software mechanism on top of that. And there are some kind of like, there's just some consideration that should be given to the fact that we are adding software and we're adding, trust assumptions, and presumably there are like a relatively small n number of like actual pre-confers that are going to be like pre-confer to that as in like whatever the entity we call that the pre-confers would outsource to do the whatever, the builders, the L2 builders, searchers, whatever.
Yeah. No, yeah. We want the validators to not be sophisticated, and if they do run sidecar, it should be like minimal on the same order of magnitude as MEV boost. And like the gateway idea is basically all about that, right? You just delegate to a gateway. If you're not happy with the gateway, just choose another gateway. But all the heavy lifting is done by the gateway. And then even cleaner than that, where you don't run any sidecar software whatsoever, you don't even run MEV boost, is execution tickets.
Mm-hmm.
All right, anything to add to that, Josh?
No, I disagree. But
Okay.
it's one of these things like, like in a year, is Yuki going to write a blog post that's going to be like, no one cares about the gateways? Who is thinking about incentivizing the gateways?
Mm-hmm.
The ultrasound gateway.
Yes, the ultrasound.
All right, so this question will be for Josh. So you talked a lot about how Ethereum has a lot of legacy issues, and maybe another project that can really make a specialized piece of software can come in now and offer this solution. So what is your view in like 5 years when maybe Ethereum actually they can implement execution tickets, maybe have zero or real-time proving? Do you still see a space for a separate sequencer entity?
Yeah, so I guess I don't think it's necessarily the like, there's like two sides. There's like Ethereum comes with extra things you don't necessarily like need or want for like the specific subset of tasks you're trying to do, right? It is like a batteries included thing, right? It has like an execution client. You're like, do I actually want like a full EVM to do like my sequencing or whatever, right? And then there is a question of like, to like the 5-year timeline of like, does it take like 5 years to add in like a core functionality that provides like an enshrined or like an in-protocol kind of solution to that? So I think trying to predict 5 years out, like props to you, Justin, for working on those timelines. But like I have been in crypto full time for a little over 3 years now. Trying to predict 5 years out sounds like a completely absurd kind of like guessing game to try to figure out like where the state of the industry will be, because it's been very, very different in the 3 years that I have been here. But I do think, if anything, we will probably see like more things because, again, execution tickets were discussed, 8 months ago is so when they came out, right, as like an idea. EPBS was 24 months ago or something like that. It's like, was it 2021?
EPBS is quite old, but yeah, execution tickets is from October, December.
Yeah, so as an idea, it is like a relatively new thing. And so to think, well, in 5 years, we will implement the idea that we have thought about for 8 months. And you're like, well, presumably in the next 5 years, we will think of some new things. And I think there's an inevitability of, I don't, and this, I think this applies to software generally. I don't think there's like a fault of Ethereum. I think it's just like how software works. It's like, I don't see the velocity of Ethereum kind of implementation kind of accelerating. You hear people talking about like the ossification. So whether it is like execution tickets are resolved and then you say, okay, great, well, we can get rid of like the gateways and we can get rid of the relays and whatever. And we've like gotten rid of a bunch of like sidecar software. But like I presume in 5 years, the blockchain space, if we go to like Tamasha's talk, right? Where are we going to be with like the AI chains, the AI agents trying to trade on chain? And maybe there is something where we say, well, okay, now we have like some sidecar that's trying to like wrangle the AI agents, and maybe we'd like to enshrine the whatever AI agent like wrangler thing. We're just wildly speculating. It's just saying, 5 years is a very long time, and I think there's inevitability of like there is value to creating new things that satisfy a problem. I think one of the questions is like how you avoid constant bootstrapping issues for this. To some degree, it's just like inevitable, but you can kind of find a balance, and it's like why we don't want like only large corporations. It's like beneficial that like larger entities, corporations, chains, foundations, whatever, slow down over time. It leaves room for startups to kind of come in and create something like newer that is like with just like less, right? It's like a more minimal thing, but it solves the task kind of more neatly because it's not trying to do many things. So I think that's just like an inevitable, like it's not a crypto specific thing, it's like a market structure thing.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Do you have any response to that, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that you want to move fast, and maybe we'll reach the singularity within 5 years, and so Ethereum's roadmap is kind of useless. I mean, I guess there are trade-offs, right? Because from an economic security standpoint, right, you're starting from scratch, and so Ethereum has $130 billion of economic security. Like, how are you going to compete with that? It also has credible neutrality. It also has all these network effects. So I think that there is a trade-off, and sure. I think it's important to be the last mover, not the first mover. I mean, one of the things that Josh mentioned a while back was, okay, in terms of, how do we prioritize execution tickets? That's something that we need in order to get like best-in-class pre-confirmations, and I agree with Josh. It turns out that just very luckily, execution tickets have a whole list of advantages. One is that they remove proposer timing games. So right now, proposers are incentivized to play timing games where they delay the get header call so that they can get more MEV. And we're starting to see sophisticated operators do exactly that. That goes away with execution tickets. Another one is MEV smoothing. So right now, as a validator, I'm incentivized to join a pool because MEV is like really spiky and it's basically a lottery. It's gambling. If you love gambling, fine. But like most people just want to run a business or have like predictable yield. Another really cool thing that execution tickets give us is MEV burn, where the MEV no longer leaks to the proposer, but it leaks to the ETH holders. And there's like all sorts of reasons why this is a better outcome, like monetary policy reasons and just sustainability reasons and whatnot, and predictability reasons. And then they also remove the relays, right? We want to get rid of the relays. And execution tickets help with that. And so in some sense, pre-confirmations is like an afterthought benefit of execution tickets, but I think they will be heavily prioritized in the months to come.
All right, so I have one more question, and it's for Josh. A common criticism of outside sequencers is that they can never attain the economic security of Ethereum. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, it's not true in like an absolute sense over like an infinite timeline, but like, yeah, I'm not kind of assuming like we're just gonna like, ramp to like $500 billion on like any new chain, right? Mm-hmm. There is fundamentally like it is at a level where like you can't just inject that much money. There's just like, even at like a nation state level, there's not just like that much money sitting around to like inject. The degens can like bid up what they want, but like usually that's gonna fall out at like 10 billion or something like that. So I think that's true. I think one of the questions is kind of like, what is the level of like what is the actual attack like user story that occurs that is like susceptible to like a lower economic security? So I think we all generally assume like, people would notice if someone was trying to acquire like adversarially like whatever, like $170 billion of ETH. Like that's just not gonna go unnoticed. But I guess my view would be that number is actually probably like quite low. It is fundamentally one of these things in the kind of like, there are the pros and cons of like centralized points in the system where if someone's like, say a chain goes off at, it's at $2 billion or whatever, right? Which is like a high number, but like given the market, that's not like an unreasonable number for like a new network to kind of like achieve over like a 6 to 12 months time frame. They're inevitable to like new chains of like, well, most of that's probably gonna be like locked for like 12 months, so you just can't even do it. It's like 17% or whatever, or like 20% or 30% is like floating. So there is that is obviously like problematic in like many ways, but there is like okay, you can't attack it because literally like the coins are locked, but as it comes unlocked, right, you have like centralizing vectors, right, of like, okay, the early investors are probably going to own whatever, like 3% tranches. Are they just gonna like market sell that? If they say, hey, you have like 5 large investors and like, one person said like, hey, one guy like messaged all of us and wanted to buy like all of our things, you're like, someone is probably going to like raise an alarm, similar to even like, where are you going to get kind of liquidity on these things, right? You're going to be like, okay, Coinbase, Binance, OKX, right? You're like, someone is also going to be like, hey, someone is buying like all of the coins, of one thing. So in like a proof of stake system, it's just like how actually like low is the bar? I don't think we've like, I think East Classic had like some forks like immediately after, right? Somewhat before my time, but I don't think we've ever had like an actual like economic kind of like attack of that form. So my view is like, it is like a good thing to consider, but it is somewhat of like theoretical is too weak from like it's not a real concern, but it is like less of a concern than I think people worry about in that like, in these newer chains that are using the kind of standard, VC distribution mechanism, your risks are probably going to be more like regulatory from like, you have like too many insiders saying, less so like someone else is going to be able to like, adversarially take over the chain. So I think it's a different design space. Again, there's problems with that. It is not, credibly neutral. It is not like permissionless. It is not like truly decentralized. I would argue that you probably see like 10 chains that we would probably call like decentralized, like if that. So yeah, I'm not overly stressed about that attack vector. And again, it's one of these things that like the way the price action on these things work, like the value will kind of rise like corresponding with like the usage of it. I don't think we've seen evidence of like a chain that had like, like whatever the PO, the proof of stake value of like a chain's validator set was like $1 billion and there was like $10 billion of TVL on the chain. I don't think we've seen evidence of like that ratio happening. So not an immediate kind of stressing point, but I think there's the truth, right? It is weaker security.
Ray, you want to give a quick rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, from a fundamental standpoint, the way I think about it is the security ratio. Like, how much value are you securing, and how much is being secured, and how much is securing? And I think a security ratio of, let's say, 100 is like reasonably good. Like, if you want to try and extract toxic MEV, maybe you can extract 1% of the TVL, through market manipulation, let's say. And if we want to be the settlement layer for the internet of value and we want to have $1 trillion secured on Ethereum, then yeah, and you want a security ratio of 100, then you need $1 trillion of economic security. And so you can't just think about it in absolute terms, you also need to think about it in relative terms. The other thing, which is kind of less fundamental and more mimetic, is this idea of a shutting point. Like, what is the blockchain that is the most secure in the world? Because that is a magnet for devs, it's a magnet for users and whatnot. Because that is the one that is most credibly neutral, going to live for decades and centuries, is the one that has the most robustness. And so again, it's not just about the absolute number, it's also about the relative ranking of the economic security.
Okay, so we're running a little short on time, so maybe each of you can give your closing remarks in like 60 seconds. Go ahead first, Justin.
I guess I'm just still extremely bullish on base sequencing. I think I do agree with Josh that we do need to move fast on the execution tickets. That's for all sorts of reasons, not just pre-confirmations. But in the grand scheme of things, that is a minor detail, and I am confident that the Ethereum community has gained this flexibility, this hard fork muscle. Like, we were able to pull off the merge. We are able tomorrow, let's fingers crossed, pull off proto-dank sharding. And I think if we can get proto-dank sharding, then we can get execution. That's just so much simpler than proto-dank sharding or the merge.
All right, Josh, 60 seconds.
Yes, I guess I'd say I'm all in favor of like Ethereum. I strongly supportive of them getting execution tickets, and I think it's been very impressive to get the merge done. To see 4.844 finally get out the door. I think that'll be very exciting. I do fundamentally think there's room in the market for competitors that can act as a positive kind of forcing function, right? What you don't want is there to only be incumbents in the market, such that they don't have exogenous kind of forcing functions to say, hey, you have to move quickly, because otherwise someone is going to try to take your market share. So I think my view is not necessarily adversarial to Ethereum in a sense of I am competing with Ethereum, but it is in the interest of we want to create competitive pressure so that the overall space can kind of improve as rapidly as possible, and everyone kind of has sufficient incentives and motivation to kind of do their best work.
All right, thank you both. This was really great discussion.
Thank you.